Hi everyone. Today's video lesson is going to focus on lesson 2.01. We are going to be focusing specifically on the decolonization of Vietnam. I know in previous lessons we talked about what decolonization was, how quickly it happened, and then those 4 reasons why Western imperial countries were willing to give up their colonies after World War II. So sort of keep that lesson in mind as you are going through today's video lesson. And those reasons for countries giving up their colonies after World War II, those will come into play here when we talk about specifically the decolonization of Vietnam. You will need your book for today's lesson. I'm going to have you read a really short section of your book and put some events in chronological order. So remember, if you don't have a hard copy of your book, there is an online version located in the course materials section of the Modern World Studies class. Today's lesson covers pages 257 to 265 in your book. Don't worry, you will not be reading all of those pages for today's video lesson, but if you are someone who does like to know where in your book certain lessons fall, you can find this one on 257 to 265. So by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to summarize Ho Chi Minh's life, work, and philosophy, and trace the development of rising Cold War tension in Vietnam. So remember the lesson that we're going to be talking about today, this decolonization of Vietnam. Again, we're still talking about the Cold War. What is going on in today's lesson with Vietnam? This decolonization of Vietnam is taking place during the Cold War. So all of those things that we have talked about during the Cold War, things like containment and communism versus capitalism, all of that still applies here. We are still talking about that 44-year-long Cold War that we started talking about last unit. All right, so hopefully you remember when we talked about colonization back in first semester, you'll remember that France was one of those Western imperial countries that ruled colonies around the world. France had colonies in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, and in Indochina, and specifically Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were their colonies that were located in Indochina. And on the map on the right-hand side of your screen, Vietnam is the one that's in the hot pink color, Laos is in orange, and then Cambodia is in yellow on this map over here. So you can see that is the area of the world that we are going to be talking about today and actually over the next couple of days when we transition into the Vietnam War. And so that way you can kind of think about where in the world we are focusing our attention for the next few lessons. Ho Chi Minh is a figure that you are going to want to know who he is, not only for today's lesson, but going forward as well when we talk about the Vietnam War. So Ho Chi Minh, he helped to lead the struggle for Vietnamese independence. Remember, when we're starting our story today talking about Vietnam, Vietnam is not an independent country. Vietnam is still a colony of France. Ho Chi Minh left Vietnam when he was 21 years old and he did not return for 30 years. During those 30 years, he traveled the world. He learned 6 languages. While he was traveling, he also read many of the philosophers of the West. He was most interested in Karl Marx, which led him to embrace communism. So hopefully you can see here a little bit of where we're going with our Cold War ideas. He returned to Vietnam in 1941 and he founded the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh helped to fight the Japanese invasion of Vietnam that happened during World War II. And the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, also helped to fight against French colonial rule. They started to fight for their independence from the French. And one of the tactics that they used while they were fighting was known as guerrilla warfare. And this is a term that we will hear a little bit more as we are going throughout the rest of World Studies class. We'll hear about guerrilla warfare from time to time. And what guerrilla warfare is when soldiers strike in small groups where it's least expected and then vanish before the enemy could respond. So when we're talking about guerrilla warfare, that's what we're talking about. Those strikes by small groups of soldiers who then retreat back into the terrain and sort of disappear before the enemy can respond. When World War II was over, Ho Chi Minh was in control of Vietnam. So it was not an independent country yet, but Ho Chi Minh was in charge. So here's where I want you to read in your book a little bit, just a short section in your book. I would like you to read page 259, the section that's called Vietnam Independent but Divided. And I want you to pay attention to some of the events in this section that you will be reading, and I want you to try and put them in order. So specifically, the 4 events that I would like you to look for in this reading are Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam as independent, the Geneva Convention was held, Vietnam is divided into North and South, and the French sent troops, and an 8-year war for independence was fought. So those are the 4 events I want you to look for. They are not in order on the slide, but what I would like you to do is while you're reading through that section, I would like you to try to put those events in order. So go ahead right now, pause the recording, go ahead and read that section, and then when you are ready to move on, just go ahead and unpause the recording and we will continue. So welcome back. I hope that you learned a few things about the decolonization of Vietnam while you were reading that section. So the events in order. The first thing that happened in Vietnam's road to independence was the fact that Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam as independent. So he declared Vietnam to be an independent country. Well, as you can imagine, the French didn't really like this idea that it was just being declared that they were independent. Remember, Vietnam is a colony of the French. So the French sent troops to Vietnam, and there an 8-year war for independence was fought. Again, remember the Viet Minh led by Ho Chi Minh were fighting against the French troops during this 8-year war for independence. Next, we have the Geneva Convention was held. And then after the Geneva Convention was held, Vietnam was then divided into North and South. So we'll have North Vietnam and we will have South Vietnam. So at the Geneva Convention, the Vietnam is going to be divided into North and South, and one of those sides, either North or South, is going to be a communist country ruled by Ho Chi Minh. But think about, why would the United States be worried about a communist regime in Southeast Asia in 1945? Remember, the Cold War is going on in 1945, and the United States wants to contain communism, so they do not want communism to spread. So this is a reason why they would be worried about a communist regime in Southeast Asia in 1945. So at the Geneva Convention, it was decided that Vietnam would be temporarily partitioned. And when we talk about partitioned, we're talking about divided. So Vietnam would temporarily be divided. Ho Chi Minh would rule North Vietnam. North Vietnam would be communist. It would be allied with the Soviet Union and China. And in North Vietnam, there would be few freedoms for the people. The government would control the economy, the newspapers, and the factories. So here we can see that it's looking a lot like the Soviet Union and China. South Vietnam, Ngo Dien Diem would be in charge of the South. The South would be anti-communist. Now, this is different from being democratic. South Vietnam was not democratic, but it was anti-communist. And the reason that it was not democratic is because Diem believed that his countrymen were not ready for a Western-style democracy. So they were not democratic, but they were anti-communist. And the United States supported him because he was anti-communist. And again, remember, during the Cold War, it was, for the United States, it was always about supporting the anti-communists, the non-communists. They could be bad leaders. They could be leaders who do horrible things, but as long as they were non-communist, the United States was going to support them. And this is a theme that we're going to see in the next couple of units, where the United States is going to support dictators. They may even support brutal dictators, But as long as they're not communist dictators, the United States is going to support them. So here we can see South Vietnam is not democratic, but they're also not communist. So because they're not communist, they're supported by the United States. At the Geneva Convention, an election was scheduled to be held in 2 years to reunite Vietnam under one president. So, like we said at the beginning, at the Geneva Convention, this partition, this division of Vietnam into North and South was supposed to be temporary. It was only supposed to last 2 years. And when those 2 years were up, an election was going to be held, one president was going to be elected, and Vietnam would be united again under one president. Well, this election never took place because the United States never allowed it to take place. One thing to know about Ho Chi Minh is that he was loved by people in Vietnam. In both North Vietnam and South Vietnam, they really liked Ho Chi Minh. And because of this, because Ho Chi Minh would be running for president during this election, he would probably win because he was loved all over Vietnam. And remember, Ho Chi Minh was communist. So the United States could not take the chance that Vietnam would become a communist country during the Cold War, and therefore they did not allow the election to take place that would have reunited Vietnam under one president. So what I want you to do on your notes is I would like you to fill out this Venn diagram. Some differences between the North and the South, and some things that were similar between the two countries. So go ahead, sort of fill that out in your notes just as a little cheat sheet for yourself so you can remember maybe who was in charge of the North and who was in charge of the South, and one side was communist and one side was anti-communist. So go ahead, fill out this Venn diagram. Remember that your notes are not going to be turned in, but they are going to be helpful for you going forward on test quizzes, and then just sort of reviewing what we have already done. So after Vietnam was partitioned into North and South, and specifically after those elections never happened, the Cold War had arrived in Vietnam. And over the next couple of lessons, we are going to see what happens as a result of the Cold War arriving in Vietnam. And we are going to be learning about the Vietnam War over the next lesson or two. So hopefully this helps you learn a little bit about how Vietnam became an independent country, how decolonization happened in Vietnam through that 8-year war for independence with France, and then what happened to Vietnam as well that would sort of lead us up to the Vietnam War happening. So keep in mind that this is all going on during the Cold War, and those Cold War tensions were going on during this time, and hopefully you can see where we are going when we start to talk about the Vietnam War over the next couple of lessons. If you do have questions, please let me know, and I will see you either in our next Class Connect or our next video lesson.